Long before its collapse, the Oyo Empire stood at the very peak of power in West Africa. By the middle of the 18th century, its authority stretched from the Niger River in the north down to the Atlantic coast, reaching into areas that today lie in Benin Republic and Togo. Other states paid tribute, not out of goodwill, but out of fear and respect of the empire. Oyo's dominance rested on two pillars. One was military strength, especially its cavalries. Sitting on open savanna rather than dense forest, Oyo could breed and maintain thousands of horses. Its mounted warriors, often described as an iron force, they could overwhelm infantry-based armies with terrifying speed. The second pillar was political structure. Oyo was not ruled by unchecked kings. The Alaafin was powerful and sacred, but it was restrained by a constitutional system. The Oyomesi, a council of 7 powerful chiefs led by the Basharu, had the authority to remove the king who ruled badly. When an Alaafin crossed the line, he was sent a symbolic message, often an empty calabash or a parrot's egg, ordering him to take his own life. This balance of power kept the empire stable for generations. In the 1770s, the balance was nearly destroyed by Basharu, a ruthless political strongman who murdered several Alaafins and ruled through terror. Order was restored only when Alaafin Abiodun finally overthrew him in 1774. Abiodun brought peace and prosperity to the land, but his rule carried a quiet weakness. Traumatized by the power of the military and the near collapse of the throne, he deliberately weakened the army to prevent future coups. He shifted focus towards trade, wealth, and civilian life. But when he died in 1789, he left behind an empire that was rich on the surface but dangerously hollow at its core. The army was neglected, and the nobility resented the authority they had lost. Into this fragile situation stepped Hole Arogangan. Hole was not an obvious or popular choice. He was a cousin of Abiodun and had lived much of his life outside the inner circle of power, earning his living as a trader. Those who later wrote about him often described a man who remembered insults too well. Years before becoming king, while trading in the town of Akwamu, he had been publicly humiliated when a local official seized his goods. When Hole finally ascended the throne, he did not forget. One of his first acts as Alaafin was to order the Are Ona Kakanfo, the empire's field marshal, Afoja of Ilorin, to attack Akwamu and bring him the head of the man who had disgraced him. This order shook the empire. Akwamu lay within Owu's territory, a Yoruba ally of Oyo. By long-standing custom, the Alaafin was forbidden from waging war against his own people. To many chiefs and generals, this was no act of justice, but a personal vendetta using the national army. Afonja obeyed the command, but the damage was done. Trust between the throne and the military cracked, and contempt quietly took roots. With a few years, the relationship between Hole and the Oyomesi had turned poisonous. The council saw him as stubborn and politically clumsy. Hole in turn believed they were scheming to reduce him to a figurehead. The military elites, especially Afonja, decided to force a final confrontation. They relied on an old principle of the Oyo political culture. An Alaafin could not be disobeyed, but he also could not command an act that violated sacred traditions without losing legitimacy. They challenged him to order an attack on Iwereile. It was a perfect trap. Iwereile was not just a fortified town. It was a sacred city tied to royal ancestry, the birthplace of the mother of the former Alaafin. To attack it was to insult ancestors themselves. Yet, Hole, perhaps desperate to prove he was still king in more than the name, gave the order. The army marched out as commanded, but when they reached Iwereile, they did not attack. Instead, they turned back towards the capital. When the soldiers returned to Oyo, they surrounded the palace and camped there for 42 days. They did not storm the walls or draw swords. They simply waited. Their message to the king was chillingly clear. The gods had rejected him. The Pa had rejected him. And even the land itself no longer accepted his rule. Inside the palace, Aole understood the truth. His servants had fled. His rituals had failed. And the belief that made the Alaafin sacred had vanished. He was a king with no kingdom. According to tradition, he prepared to die, but not before leaving a final mark on history. In the palace courtyard, he carried mud pots and a bow with arrows. He shot one arrow northward, another southward, and the third one towards the west. Then he pronounced a curse. He condemned his people for disloyalty and declared that their children would be carried away as slaves, sold to the north, to the south, and across the great water to the west. With force, he smashed the pot on the ground and declared that just as this pot was broken, the Yoruba land could never be restored in unity, that the unity of the Yoruba land can never be whole again. That night, Alaafin Aole took poison and died. His death marked the beginning of a century of chaos. The empire unraveled exactly as he had foretold it. Afonja broke away from Oyo and declared Ilorin independent, inviting Fulani Muslim warriors and Hausa fighters to strengthen his position. Instead, they turned on him and killed him, and transformed Ilorin into an emirate under the Sokoto Caliphate. Oyo lost his northern shield. In 1835, with the empire already fractured and weak, Fulani forces from Ilorin sacked Oyo itself. The great capital was burned. The survivors fled south to the forest, where they later founded the new Oyo. The empire was finished. For decades afterwards, Yoruba subgroups fought one another in bitter wars. Ibadan, Egba, Ijebu, Ijesha, and others clashed repeatedly. Millions were displaced, and vast numbers of captives were sold into slavery. As Aole had caused, Yoruba men, women, and children were carried north, south, and across the Atlantic to places like Brazil, Cuba, and the Caribbean. By the time the British arrived in the late 19th century to impose treaties and colonial rule, they were not conquering a unified superpower. They were stepping into the reins of a civilization that had torn itself apart. The story of Aole remembered not just as a tragedy, but as a warning today. Empires do not usually fall because of enemies at the gates. They fall when trust collapses inside the palace, when the institution fails, and when personal grudges outweighs the survival of the state. The shattered pot of Oyo never came back together till today.